So with that, I want to turn the meeting over to Eric Meyer to introduce our special guest.
Well, thanks so much, Tim, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. So today we have Eric Ingersoll. He's the founder and managing director of Lucid Catalyst and TerraPraxis. Eric, he's a strategic advisor and entrepreneur with deep experience in the commercialization of new energy technologies. He has extensive project policy experience in renewables, energy storage, oil and gas, and nuclear, with a special emphasis on advanced nuclear technologies. He develops commercialization and market entry strategies for advanced energy technologies, such as advanced nuclear power generation, carbon capture, and zero carbon liquid fuels, which fits very well into our theme of decarbonizing flight and everything else today. So let's see, Eric published some pretty impressive reports over the last couple of years. He was on the team for MIT's study on the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world, principal author of ETI's Nuclear Cost Drivers Report, and leads multiple decarbonization modeling efforts and advising governments all over the world and private sector on electricity and fuels applications of advanced nuclear and fusion energy systems. Let's see, Eric, he's a leader, strategic advisor to over 30 startups, has raised over $100 million of private equity for General Compression, which was an energy storage company that he told me about, I think the first time we met. Very cool. He's been a member of the Renewable Energy Advisory Group of the National Commission on Energy Policy, and was honored at the Obama White House as a champion of change in renewable energy. Pretty impressive resume there. I'm thinking, man, I got to work on my bio. Thanks so much for joining us, Eric. Really looking forward to your comments tonight, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm flattered and heartened by the fact that you're all willing to, either skip dinner or eat an early dinner or eat a late dinner to come and work on climate change. I've been more or less professionally and personally obsessed with helping to solve the climate challenge for about 30 years, maybe even 35 years. And haven't been all that successful, I guess, at that. But I do feel like there is an increasing focus on solutions. More people there. We still don't have enough people sort of on the climate wagon here with us, but we have a much larger number than we did, say, 20 years ago. And I think even though there's a lot of happy talk about, we're deploying all of these new technologies and we're going to, have electric cars everywhere and all this stuff, which are great. We're really just getting started. And I don't know if any of you have read this book, Ministry for the Future. Has anybody read that book? Okay. Well, I think it would be a great book to read for your book group. It's a science fiction book that takes place in the near future, and it's about a sort of committed group of people that start to do everything they can to address the climate crisis. And the reason, one of the reasons I mentioned is that I read the book last year. And this year, it seemed like all of a sudden I was living in the book with the fires and the sort of plagues and all of the challenges that we're facing today. So I'm going to talk about decarbonizing aviation. Is that visible?
Yep.
Great. So And I'm specifically going to talk about synthetic fuels. So when you sort of generally, when you talk about decarbonization, what you tend to hear is we need to move away from using fuels. We're going to electrify everything. You probably heard all of this. You know, what kind of batteries are long distance trucks going to use, or how are we going to fit batteries in airplanes, or we're going to have to stop flying, or all these sorts of things. And, you know, highly conscious people like you might actually affect, you might change your flying behavior because of climate change. But there's only a very small percentage of people who will do that. And there's a much larger group of people who are becoming wealthier in the world. There's something like 2 to 4 billion people who will join the global middle class in the coming decades. And they're all hoping to take vacations and fly to exotic places and visit their faraway relatives, or, you know, get educated in a different country, or go to a different country to work. And the very small amount of consumer behavior that we can affect through kind of moral suasion is going to be dwarfed by this increase in demand for travel. So there isn't a way to like moralize our way out of having to solve the long distance travel problem. And these jets are thirsty. Even the very efficient ones consume a very large amount of fuel. And the forecast in the growth of demand for jet fuel is that it will more than double by 2050. So this is with all the, you know, fancy new jets that are twice as efficient, and, you know, all that other kind of strategies for reducing demand for jet fuel baked into the forecast. And so what I've done on this graph is a little preview of what I'm going to talk about. Normally, we just see the graph and we see, you know, 2 billion barrels or 5 billion barrels or something like that, which in itself is a fairly difficult thing to conceive of. One of the things that I find helpful in thinking about our fossil fuel use, our liquid fossil fuel use, is to think of it in terms of how many barrels we use per second. Because it's a small, even though a second is a short amount of time, it's a much smaller number of barrels. Like 5 billion barrels, I really have no idea. I've never seen 5 billion barrels before. But 1,000 barrels a second is sort of, you know, something you can almost conceive of, like having them stacked along 10 football fields or 5 football fields in a long row, and then having that row go by you every second. That's our liquid fossil fuel use. And this is about 5% of that. No, it's a lot less than that. It's about 3% of that. But it's still a lot of fuel, and it's one of the fastest growing. Between this and shipping, they're 2 of the fastest growing uses of fossil fuel, and actually 2 of the most difficult to decarbonize as well. And they both are highly indexed to prosperity. They're highly indexed to trade, which is highly indexed to prosperity. And so they're really a kind of an indicator that we're doing better in the world financially and economically. So we don't actually want to stop these things. We just want them to stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So one of the approaches to this is what's called sustainable aviation fuels, or some people call them SAFs, which I don't really like. But most of the ones that are available today, and you might have read Bill Gates's book or some of these other people talking about sustainable aviation fuel, they're either made from waste organic matter, like cooking oil. So you can basically process cooking oil through a hydrotreater and an upgrader and make it into a kerosene type fuel that can be burnt in a jet. Or there are some kind of biomass to fuels technologies. But in general, these the resource bases for these are limited. The 5 billion barrels that we need in 2050 is way more than the number of deep fryers in the world could supply. So we have a kind of mismatch problem, and current forecasts for the supply of sustainable aviation fuels through these methods that I described have a hard time getting to a level of supply that's equal to 5% of the market. The other thing you can see here is that these fuels, that the fossil fuel price in dollars per liter is around 50 cents a liter. These fuels are somewhere between 2 and 6 times or 7 times as expensive as that. And it's very difficult you can't really change the price of fuels for airlines by, say, a factor of 3 or 4 and still have your sort of average person be able to access flight. It would become a luxury item that only very wealthy people could afford. I think quadrupling the price, which would be the kind of average increase for using these types of sustainable fuels, would add more than $1,000 to a round trip ticket to the UK, for example. So it would make a $800 to $1,000 ticket into a $2,000 ticket. So one of the things that's very important to keep in mind is that if we're going to make synthetic fuels, and there are people proposing to make use solar energy to make hydrogen, or using wind energy to make hydrogen, and then use that hydrogen to combine with CO2 to kind of run the combustion process backwards and use that to make a synthetic hydrocarbon. The principal energy input for that process is in the form of the hydrogen that you make. So the cost of the fuel is really determined by the cost of that hydrogen. In the case of synthetic hydrocarbons, it's also determined by the cost of the carbon material that you're using, which is in the form of CO2, which costs something to collect from the environment or from another source. So what this graph shows you is, for a given cost of CO2, this is, in other words, what you're paying to get the CO2. This isn't your carbon tax. This is your input, the cost of one of your inputs. If you assume that the CO2 costs you about $50 a ton, this shows you what your cost of hydrogen needs to be if you want to have a reasonably cost competitive synthetic hydrocarbon. So in other words, if you want to use some electrical energy source and use that to make a fuel that can be burned in a jet engine, this middle line here, this middle green line, shows you what the cost of that fuel will be for these different hydrogen costs. So the cost per kilogram of hydrogen. And the bands at the bottom show the kind of different price domains that we're used to. So high oil price domain is around, prices have gone over $100 a barrel, but they typically don't. And so higher prices would be between 75 and 100. Sort of medium prices are between 50 and 75. And low prices are below 50. And whenever the price of oil has stayed over $100 a barrel for a substantial period of time, we've had a global recession. So the economy is very susceptible to high energy prices in a very negative way. So what would be ideal is if we could make synthetic jet fuel at a price that was relatively close to what we currently pay for jet fuel, but make it in a way so it's carbon neutral. This particular kind of strategy is what we call an impossible burger strategy. It's like a burger, tastes like a burger. You buy it where you buy a burger. You can cook it the same way you cook a burger, except that it's not made from meat. And this could be an Impossible Burger fuel, which you can move around in barrels and tankers and pipelines. Your jet engine doesn't know that it's being fed something different because it's exactly chemically the same, but it was made through a process that extracted carbon dioxide from the environment and therefore isn't adding any new carbon dioxide to the environment when it's combusted. So to do that, we're going to need, as you can see from the axis on the bottom here, to stay in the realm of traditional oil prices, we're going to need to have hydrogen below $1.50 a kilogram. So this chart then shows you kind of different indicative costs for hydrogen production. So and therefore fuel production costs for different types of technologies in different types of locations. So the first thing to notice is that renewable costs are highly location dependent. So if I put some solar panels out in my backyard, they're going to have shade on them. You know, there's snow at different times of the year. I'm going to get a capacity factor of about, 12 to 14% here in Massachusetts. If I put them in Bakersfield, in the middle of a big, nice field, I'll get almost twice as much energy out of them every year, and they'll cost about the same. So what that means is the cost of energy from a solar project in Bakersfield is going to be approximately half what it is in Massachusetts. So there isn't a kind of like, oh, it's cheap everywhere kind of thing. You have to find the places where the resources are really good. And if what you're trying to do is make really cheap energy, then you really have to focus on the extremely good resources. And what you're seeing across the bottom there which is expressed as a percentage, is what's called the capacity factor, which is the equivalent full-time hours that the plant operates. And so solar projects have much lower capacity factors than wind projects, and wind projects have much lower capacity factors than, say, nuclear plants and geothermal plants. And because there's an important capital cost component to these systems, the things that you make the hydrogen with and that you make the fuel with, if you don't utilize them all the time, they end up having a kind of disproportionately high cost per unit of output. So if you make 10 barrels a day with something that costs $1 million, you're not recovering very much of your $1 million with each barrel, or you're putting a lot of cost on each barrel to help recover that capital cost. So the more hours a year that you can operate your hydrogen equipment, your hydrogen producing equipment, the cheaper it will be. And in fact, if you have the same input electricity cost, if you operate the equipment twice as many hours a year, your hydrogen will be approximately half the cost. So running things at high capacity factors makes a huge difference. The other factor, of course, and that's why we see that there are a number of surprisingly low cost numbers over on the right-hand side with the nuclear plants, even though some of the dots kind of on the nuclear side, like the first of a kind US, EU, and the second of a kind US, EU dots, even though those are what we would all think of as very expensive plants, they run all the time. And if that output were dedicated to hydrogen production, they would actually be very competitive with solar, even solar in very good locations, and even offshore wind in very good locations. What the graph also shows is that by changing the way we deliver plants like that, there's a potential to make very low cost hydrogen, and to make hydrogen in the cost ranges that we saw in the previous graph were needed to make large scale synthetic fuels. So let's look briefly at how that process would work. This is, you know, unless there are chemists in the group who want to ask me more detailed chemistry questions, I'll keep this quite high level. But this is showing, for example, using geothermal heat, that you would use the geothermal heat to power a steam turbine. The steam turbine would make electricity and heat. Some of the heat would go to a calciner that is converting limestone into lime and CO2. And the rest of the electricity and steam would go to a high temperature electrolysis unit that would then convert that high temperature steam into hydrogen. And this particular model is showing something called co-electrolysis, which is something that you can do with high temperature electrolyzers, which means you can electrolyze a combination of water and CO2 at the same time. And that produces the ingredients that you need to go into your fuel reactor, your Fischer-Tropsch reactor, which is a big chemistry plant. And that combines the hydrogen and the carbon monoxide into a hydrocarbon. And depending on a whole bunch of process details, you can produce different types of hydrocarbons, so you can produce exactly what is needed for jet fuel. And in fact, in South Africa and Germany, in South Africa, because they don't have their own oil, they used coal to run this process. And same with Germany during World War II. And both have supplied substantial, transportation fleets this way. But it's not necessary to use coal if you have a source of CO2 and a source of electricity. Let's see if I can move to the next slide here. So we have just completed a very detailed study looking at how to deploy these types of technologies in a very cost-effective way. So there's one aspect of this system diagram is, can you technically do it? And the answer is, of course, yes, it can be done and has been done a lot before, but it needs to be done in a way that we can both deploy units very cheaply and deploy many of them. Because if we could make one and it was very cheap, but it took us 10 years to do it, it wouldn't really be a scalable solution to match the 5 billion barrels of demand that we need to power the global fleet. So this is the result of that detailed cost analysis that we did for the Electric Power Research Institute. And it shows the average market price for jet fuel in 2019. In 2020, there were a number of factors, as you remember, that depressed the price for jet fuel. So it's a kind of unusually low year. And this dotted line, this red dotted line, is the projected cost that we got out of our detailed techno-economic simulations and the kind of design work we did on how to lower the cost of these nuclear-powered synthetic fuel production platforms. And I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. But we also put on here the range of price costs for sustainable aviation fuels to give you a sense of the difference. And it turns out that our dotted line is actually very close to the average for the last 10 years for jet fuel. The average is about $88 a barrel because jet fuel is a refined product, so it trades at a margin to crude oil. And our cost was $92, but pretty close. So I'm just going to go back to a previous graph and point out something that we didn't talk about before. So this is again the forecast for the growth for jet fuel. Now, if we look at the other side of the graph, on the right-hand side, you see I've labeled that axis differently. That's labeled in gigawatts electric. So what that's telling you is if you were making fuel with high capacity factor resources, plants that can run at about 90% of the time, to replace today's jet fuel consumption, you would need around 640 gigawatts of high capacity factor resources. So that's kind of very close to what the United States grid. The United States grid doesn't run most of its power plants at a 90% capacity factor, but if it did, you could serve the electric load of the United States with that. So we need about a United States worth of generation to make the fuel just to support today's aircraft fleet. And as we discussed earlier, if we're going to supply all of it that's expected to be used in 2050, we need about 2.5 times that. So it's not good enough just to make these things cheap. We have to be able to make a lot of them quickly in order to supply this. And it has to be cheap enough so that people are willing to switch to this instead of buying fossil fuel. So we have been doing a lot of work on how you could make these production platforms in highly advanced shipyards. So the large container ships of the world and the tankers and the other, large commercial vessels are made in about 20 different shipyards around the world. And they're made in kind of highly automated, very efficient, highly engineered processes. And so we use the cost models that can be used to cost these types of production environments, and we kind of redesigned these production platforms to be made in this kind of production environment, and then sort of figured out what they would cost. And we found something very interesting, which is that we tend to think of nuclear plants as being very expensive to build new ones. And it's true that there's been some famous ones in the United States and in Europe that have been very expensive. And but when you look at the broader deployments of these things, like, for example, the Japanese fleet or the French fleet or the Korean fleet, you see that actually the cost of those plants delivered is way, way less than that. And so the second bar here shows in light green the savings that, compared to our expensive first of a kind plants that we have tried to build here in the last decade or so. We then contrast that with a same type of reactor, but reconfigured to be built in a shipyard. And that, again, lowers the cost by about another 50%. And then if we then take an advanced reactor, such as a molten salt reactor or something like that, and make that in a shipyard, because they're much simpler and more compact and don't have the same kind of active safety systems and other things like that, they're much cheaper. There's much less complexity that you have to manage in the manufacturing or construction process. And that lends itself well to a shipyard environment. So we see that you could get a advanced reactor plant delivered for approximately $1,200 a kilowatt, which would make it the cheapest generator that we have on the grid, just as a sort of point of comparison. Then there's a kind of further cost reduction that comes from the process of making thousands of them. And that's not very big compared to these other big bars, but it's a kind of a meaningful reduction. It's approximately another 25% to 30% reduction. So we also, as part of this project, looked at the reduction of some of the other principal capital cost items in these plants. And one of them is the high temperature steam electrolysis equipment. And although that's just being commercialized today, there's been a lot of work at some of the national labs kind of working on how you could redesign the systems, especially if you're building bigger systems that you're going to be deploying into large plants like this, and how those innovations and deployment models could lower the cost. And our analysis shows that if you can get to below $400 a kilowatt for these things, you can achieve those extremely low costs for hydrogen that I showed on the other chart. So we're almost done here. So I'll just show a couple more pictures. So this is a kind of artist's rendition of an offshore production platform. Looks like a ship, the big green thing, but it's actually not. It's anchored. It's made in a shipyard, and it's made in a dry dock. It's made in the same sort of dry dock and shipyard that makes container ships, which is why the hull looks kind of like a container ship hull. But it's full of production equipment and some advanced heat sources like advanced nuclear reactors and electrolyzers to make hydrogen. And this one is receiving a delivery of crushed limestone, which goes through the calciner to make the CO2. And then when the crushed limestone is loaded onto the ship, the production platform offloads the lime, which is the result of the calcining operation. That goes back onto the red ship, and that's mixed in with the ocean water as the ship returns to pick up more limestone. And that deacidifies the ocean and actually causes, it captures about 1.7 times the CO2 that would be released by burning the fuel because of the bicarbonate reaction in ocean water. So it both deacidifies and helps create a carbon negative fuel. So by burning this fuel, you'd be essentially putting 1.7 tons, you'd be sequestering 1.7 tons for every ton of emissions that you create. And one of the things that we believe is that we're going to have to start thinking beyond neutrality in terms of carbon, that we're going to have to start trying to make all of our processes carbon negative, not just carbon neutral, because of the extent of, because of the amount of carbon that's already made it into the air. And then this is the final picture. This is an airport in Africa. And when you look at the maps of, I was going to show a video earlier, but we didn't really have time. When you look at the maps of where all the planes are in the world, on a typical day, there's 500,000 people in the air. When there's 5 billion people living in Africa, and say half of them have joined the global middle class, we're going to see a lot more flights in Africa than we do today. And we're also going to see a massive continued growth of flights in Asia, the fastest growing aviation market. And I think, you know, we have to plan for solutions that you know, it's not fair for us to have done all this flying and then tell people who are developing that it's too bad, you know, we used up all the carbon budget already and they're not supposed to fly anywhere or something. So our vision really here is that we need to develop these scalable technologies to enable economic growth, to enable prosperity. And that if we're trying to force a choice between prosperity and carbon emissions will always lose. So we have to structure our policies to support sort of non-choices here rather than kind of Damoclean choices or choices between two impossible, you know, an impossible choice that you can't do either of. So that's what I have to share, and I'd love to hear anybody's comments and answer any questions. And I hope you found it, you know, inspiring and a slight cause for optimism. We are actually getting significant interest from some big oil companies who are interested in pursuing this vision, and we hope that we can make it a reality.